So the video game landscape could be making a massive shift here, heading into the next generation and beyond, because a lot of things have happened over this past, I'd say 12-month period, maybe even a bit longer, that has drastically changed the way that we have known video games this generation. For starters, obviously Nintendo Switch, the passing of Satoru Iwata, but the Switch was still kind of his brainchild, and, Tatsumi Kimishima kind of brought it to market, and everything's been going well, and Switch has kind of changed the game in its own unique ways that are awesome, and actually are, inspiration for our channel on the whole. But there's other changes as well. You have Microsoft, where Phil Spencer took over the Microsoft Xbox division and then got promoted to a higher up position, as, heading game stuff and on the board, and can now try to funnel more money into Xbox and try to, even possibly create a brand deal, purchasing out EA as an example. I don't know if that's going to happen, but he definitely has a lot more power to control how Xbox is shaped in the future. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Xbox 2, or whatever they end up calling the next Xbox, how that does, because Phil Spencer didn't get to control how Xbox One was taken to market, or really anything else about it, and we see that, when he's had control, which is typically with the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X, that the marketing for those systems was pretty good, even though, obviously, we could talk about the criticism of Scalebound, being canceled, and Crackdown being delayed, and, Microsoft needing to get more third-party games, or more exclusive games, I should say. But whatever, especially if they purchase EA, clearly the landscape is changing on their end. And to complete the trifecta, Sony is also making an interesting change. So this April, their current CEO, Kaz Hirai, will be stepping down. And the new CEO is going to be Kenichiro Yoshida. Now, Yoshida's been back with, used to be with Sony a while back, then came back to Sony in 2013. Kaz Hirai, was in the PlayStation division, then took over as CEO in 2012, and kind of led the PlayStation 4, and the huge push for that, and obviously the end of the PlayStation 3 life. And he had a lot of titles. He is director, this is Kaz Hirai, director, representative, corporate executive officer, president, and chief executive officer. And on April 1st, he will still be a director and chairman, where Yoshida's current titles are director, representative, corporate executive officer, executive deputy president, and chief financial officer. And in April, he's going to be Sony's director, representative, corporate executive officer, president, and CEO. So Hirai effectively is going to be not doing a whole lot, even though he's still going to hold, a couple titles at Sony and still have a say. Kaz Hirai is essentially stepping down, entering, I don't know if it's semi-retirement or if he just wants to pursue other things, and keep his connection to Sony. Again, Sony's a Japanese company. There's a lot of respect, and respect is important. What you've done is important, and because of what he's done, maybe that's why he even gets to retain a couple titles, and maybe have a say in some board meetings or something, which, it's got to be a little awkward when you go from CEO, but you're still at the company, so you're still on the board, and you still might get to say something at a board meeting, but ultimately you can get completely shut down by the person you apparently handpicked to succeed you. And obviously he had a really short run as CEO, right? From 2012 to April of 2018. That's not very long. That's under 6 years. That's very, very unusual, especially since Sony has made a comeback under him. Now, the reason that this massive shift matters is not just because Kaz Hirai was a PlayStation person, obviously focused a lot on the PlayStation brand, but it's because of who Yoshida is. Yoshida is kind of has a reputation about him of being a bit of a maverick when it comes to cutting costs, when it comes to making radical shifts that benefit financially. There's a reason that he was CFO and the manager of their money, because he is a shrewd businessman who is not afraid to trim the fat. And there are things that Sony could probably do at trimming their phone division. Maybe they need to stop making movies. I'm not sure how much Sony Pictures is really bringing in these days. We know that they had massive failures with their laptops in the past. And yes, believe it or not, PlayStation 3 for a period of time was not a system that really felt like it was worth investing in from Sony's side of things. Obviously, this all shifted, and I'm not going to argue that he's going to get rid of the PlayStation brand, but there could be certain elements that are going to affect PlayStation. PlayStation's obviously one of their most profitable ventures, so he's going to be all in on whatever PlayStation 5 is, but it is concerned that it's going to change the importance of certain aspects of Sony's PlayStation division. Because Kaz Hirai didn't necessarily care about the money as much as he cared about driving innovation, driving creativity, supporting, developers that need more time to make things. As an example, there's been rumblings that Sony wasn't very happy, or certain members of Sony weren't very happy when God of War had to be delayed to the date it is now in April. But ultimately, that needed to happen because the game's going to end up being better for it. And under Kaz Hirai, they were afforded that time. Under Yoshida, they might not have been afforded that time. They might have had to release a game that was buggy and unfinished and not really fitting with the original vision of what they wanted this game to be at launch. And this isn't even counting the fact that Sony themselves don't really have a ton of internal studios. This is kind of lost on a lot of people because there's all these PlayStation exclusives. Well, that's money out of Sony's hand going to other third-party developers for those exclusives and other indie developers. It's not like Nintendo, where Nintendo has a ton of internal studios, and then they also buy out other studios like Retro Studios, and then only have a select handful of other companies, like Grezzo or Next Level Games, etc. Bandai Namco for Smash before, working on other games for Nintendo. Nintendo has a lot of internal studios. Microsoft and Sony, not so much. And, Sony has a lot of partnerships with smaller games and just... you get a game like Bloodborne out the door, and if these games aren't necessarily performing extremely well financially, that's something that Yoshida would pull the plug on. Instead of focusing on great original content and all this stuff, Yoshida isn't really that kind of person. If he doesn't see a big financial return, he's just not going to budget that kind of stuff in the future. And the problem with this approach, and this is a problem that obviously, I'm not saying that he's planning for this to occur, but last time Sony was in a position of great strength in the video game industry, like top dog, controlling a large majority of gamers at the time, was during the PlayStation 2 days. And back then they started to care a lot about money again, and that kind of led to some cockiness and to some shrewdness in their spending. Just in terms of people are just going to buy our product because it's PlayStation, and releasing that $600 PlayStation 3, and it kind of hurt them. Yes, they bounced back at the end of the generation, but that PlayStation 3 generation was not a very profitable venture for Sony. And if that happens with PlayStation 5, one, you're going to see Yoshida be like, look, we got to pivot. We got to stop doing PlayStation. That's one fear that could happen. And another one is that, putting a money man in control really changes the outlook of how Sony's approach to the video game industry is. It goes from wanting to make money but also trying to please consumers to being solely focused on just making money. And this could lead to things like what EA does, where they're highly focused on squeezing as much money out of every game they release. Whether or not the game is good or not, they just want to make the most amount of money possible. And that's just kind of the way that EA is. I'm not saying that businesses in general aren't that way, but some are happy with certain profit margins, while others are only happy if they get to the extreme end of profit margins, where they, not only get their money back for the development of the game, but they, also get like 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000+% return on your original development cost, or more. I mean, I have really no idea. I haven't examined EA's figures yet to see what kind of money they're pulling in FIFA and Madden Ultimate Teams. I know it's a lot, but yeah, this is just a concern for me in general, not just for Sony, because some people might have an impression, because we're a Nintendo channel, that I actually should be happy about this news, because it could open up a pathway, because you guys know I own an Xbox One. It's like open up a pathway for Microsoft, for Phil Spencer leading the way to become like the dominant underbox TV, and open up a pathway for Nintendo to dominate out of Japan. And I understand maybe on paper that sounds nice to some people, but I actually don't like the idea of Sony going to their cocky ways, because I have a lot of respect for the PlayStation 4 and Sony on the whole. I'm not saying that, that they are a company that necessarily deserves anyone's respect, just like I could say the same thing about Nintendo and Microsoft. These are multi-billion-dollar companies that, yes, their bottom line is about making money, but it's still not good for the industry, I don't think, for this kind of move to happen when it's happening. And this is not me being upset at Kaz Hirai. He's choosing to step down. It doesn't sound like they're forcing him out. At least the way he's making it sound like, it doesn't sound like he's being forced out. It'd be really weird if he was too, considering that they have returned to profitability under him. But it could be one of those things where, okay, we've gotten maybe as far as we think we can get with you financially. Now we need someone in to come start cutting stuff and trying to maximize profits. And that's when Sony starts putting money ahead of creating compelling, games and compelling consumers to buy their products, and they're more focused on just squeezing as much money as they can out of each individual person. That's when Sony usually gets into trouble. We've seen Sony do this before, and I think the great fear here is with a money man in control that they're going to try to do this again in the following generation of systems. Again, you could argue this is good news for Nintendo, but I think this is bad news for gamers on the whole. I think competition, healthy competition for Nintendo out of Japan, healthy competition in the West here from Microsoft is extremely important for everyone to continue to push gaming forward in whatever way it is. I know some people will say, oh, who cares about Xbox One X and their 4K and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. Some people do. Other people would argue, who cares if you could take your games with you on the go? Because that's not something that matters to them. I feel like it is good to have all these different options and have these companies pushing each other because it's just going to bring out the best in them. Because when you create a market where there's healthy competition, that's going to make companies care more about consumers because they need to get the mind share of the consumers in order to buy their products. Nintendo Switch is largely flying off shelves because Nintendo started to care about the mind share of core gamers again. And they haven't really cared about that in a long time because of the success of Wii. So it's one of those things where you start to see a company caring about mind share of gamers, and suddenly they start making better decisions that are much more pro-consumer. And that doesn't mean everything's perfect. Of course, Nintendo's going to start charging for online, and we don't know what that's going to entail. But still, we're in an era now where things are changing, and the landscape is changing with Microsoft with their Game Pass and $10 a month for brand new games day and date, and Phil Spencer being up in a higher position, which is going to allow him to fund even more money into the Xbox division and possibly making a massive acquisition of EA. You have Sony changing their CEOs at a key time when obviously they got to be looking towards the future, what's next for PlayStation, and then obviously Nintendo with their huge turnaround under Tatsumi Kimishima, and Reggie Fils-Aimé even getting promoted up to a position in Japan. Although he's still, I think, the CEO of Nintendo of America. He has another title in Japan that's even higher than CEO of NOA, that is. Obviously, there's nothing higher than president and CEO of Nintendo of Japan, but you know what I mean. We're just in a very interesting place, and I'm curious on your guys' thoughts on this stuff. What I'm going to do in the description, I'm going to put a link to the Kaz Hirai article on Kotaku, because that's where I got a lot of my information from on Kaz Hirai and Yoshida and all that stuff, so you guys can see some of the same background information I did. I also am going to include a link to Dreamcast Guy's video where he was actually expressing some concerns for Sony over this changeover. I feel a little bit of it's a bit hyperbole per se, but he does have some interesting perspectives in terms of the money man aspect of Sony and what's happened before, as someone like him who's been a fan of Sony for a lot longer than I have. And then I'll also include a link, to explaining the Xbox Game Pass situation and the announcement of Phil Spencer's new position, so you can kind of get a bit greater grasp on that. I don't feel like I need to include any links for Nintendo. I think we're all Nintendo fans. We know what's happening with Switch. We know how well it's selling. We know whether we like it or not at this point. So yeah, you guys let me know where you think the video game landscape is heading as we move into a new generation of hardware in a few years here, and where Nintendo's role is going to be in that with Switch or a brand new version of Switch. What's going to happen with Microsoft and Sony. And please, I know this is the kind of video where you might get some fan wars down there, but let's not puff out our chest and be happy about this. Let's not start berating other consoles and other systems. Let's actually talk about how this could potentially affect the health of the video game industry moving forward. Anyways, folks, I'm Nathaniel Rufflegents from Nintendo Prime, and if you like this video, you know what to do, and if you dislike the video, hit that dislike button, subscribe for more content, and I will catch you guys in the next one.